What if JFK had been a Republican? John F. Kennedy is widely revered as a symbol of optimism, progress, and charisma in American history, a young and vibrant Democratic president who shaped the political landscape of the 1960s. But what if the history books told a different story? What if JFK had been a Republican instead of a Democrat? How would his political identity, policies, and legacy have shifted? And how might this alternate scenario have reshaped American politics as we know it? In this thought-provoking exploration, we analyze the possibilities and implications of this hypothetical scenario, inviting you to dive deep into the crossroads of ideology, leadership, and history. Could a Republican JFK have steered America down an entirely different path? Let's explore the what-ifs. Although JFK is celebrated as a Democratic icon, certain aspects of his presidency reveal significant alignment with Republican values of the time. Take, for example, his 1962 tax reforms, which aimed to cut taxes significantly, a move prioritizing economic growth and closely aligned with conservative fiscal principles. Similarly, JFK's staunch anti-communist stance, as evidenced by his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis and his vocal opposition to Soviet influence, resonates with Republican foreign policy ideals. Moreover, his commitment to military strength and national defense, a cornerstone of his administration, also aligns neatly with Republican values from the mid-20th century. Yet Kennedy's affiliation with the Democratic Party was likely shaped by his family's roots and influence, especially his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., a prominent Democratic figure. But here's the question. Under different circumstances, would these policy inclinations have drawn JFK toward the Republican Party instead? Imagine he'd grown up under a father who leaned Republican or a political climate where GOP priorities resonated more with his personal ideology. Could he have switched parties and championed a conservative platform? Let's move forward to the pivotal 1960 presidential election, which pitted Kennedy against Richard Nixon. Historically, JFK's Democratic campaign relied heavily on a coalition of blue-collar workers, minorities, and Southern whites, a remnant of the New Deal coalition. As a Republican candidate, Kennedy would need a drastically different approach to secure the presidency. Would JFK, with his charm and eloquence, still have captured the imagination of voters against Nixon? Perhaps his personal charisma, so celebrated in his televised debates, could have transcended party boundaries. A Republican JFK likely would have emphasized conservative economic reforms, anti-communism, and a robust defense policy that appealed to right-leaning and moderate voters alike. Such a shift could have created a political earthquake. If JFK had run as a Republican, Democrats would have been forced to restructure their platform, possibly leaning further left on social and economic issues to differentiate themselves. The voter coalitions of the time, the bedrock of each party's strength, might have fractured, permanently altering the American political playing field. Now let's imagine Kennedy had captured the presidency as a Republican. How would this have reshaped his administration's priorities? His economic policies, for instance, would likely have aligned naturally with the GOP's vision of lower taxes and reduced government intervention. The landmark tax cuts of 1964, credited to both Kennedy and later Lyndon B. Johnson, might have been delivered with even stronger support from a Republican majority. On the international stage, JFK's Republican identity might not have altered his handling of the Cold War substantially, as his anti-communist stance would have been compatible with GOP priorities. However, we might have seen an even more aggressive approach to defense buildup, potentially altering the tone of the arms race. His decisive handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis might also have been characterized with a more explicitly conservative rhetoric. One area rife with uncertainties is Kennedy's approach to civil rights. As president, Kennedy eventually embraced civil rights reform, but he did so cautiously to retain the Southern bloc of the Democratic Party. As a Republican, would he have championed civil rights with stronger conviction, or deprioritized it to maintain favor with Southern conservatives? This pivotal question underscores how party affiliation shapes not only policies, but the pace and extent of social progress in America. The 1960s were transformative years for the civil rights movement, and Kennedy played a critical, though at times hesitant, role in supporting legislative progress. However, the Republican Party of the 1860s had been historically tied to emancipation and civil rights. Could JFK, as a Republican, have accelerated policy shifts in favor of racial equality, perhaps leveraging his party's legacy as the Party of Lincoln? There's room for argument here. As a Republican leader, JFK could have positioned civil rights as a bipartisan effort, gaining support from moderates across party lines. Conversely, he might have felt compelled to placate Southern conservatives in his party, much as Democratic leaders did, delaying critical reforms. A Republican effort to lead on civil rights might also have shifted the cultural alignment of the two parties. African American voters, who began shifting toward the Democratic Party during the New Deal era, might have remained staunchly Republican under a GOP-led civil rights push. Such a shift could have drastically altered the voter base we associate with each party today. Beyond Kennedy's presidency, the broader question arises: how would his Republican affiliation have altered the long-term trajectories of both political parties? In reality, the Democratic Party of JFK's era was already shifting, moving from its Southern conservative roots to a more progressive national platform. The Republican Party, meanwhile, was gaining ground among fiscally conservative and socially traditionalist voters. A Republican Kennedy might have turned these trends on their heads. His presidency could have dismantled the Democratic New Deal coalition earlier than it disintegrated in the 1970s, forcing the left to redefine itself sooner. Conversely, a populist, charismatic Republican figure like Kennedy might have softened the edges of conservative politics, reshaping the GOP into a more centrist party. It's also worth considering how a Republican JFK would have influenced key successors, like Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon. Would LBJ have still seized on civil rights as a defining Democratic issue, or would he have leaned toward economic reforms to regain lost ground? And how might Nixon, a figure who emulated JFK in both rhetoric and campaign style, have shaped his presidency in contrast to Kennedy's Republican legacy? JFK's mythos as a Democratic president is woven into the very fabric of his legacy. From his famous call to service, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," to his youthful optimism, Kennedy inspired generations of Americans to believe in progress. But would that legacy have endured if those messages had been delivered through a Republican lens? The answer likely hinges on how Kennedy's party affiliation would have shaped public perception. As a Republican, Kennedy's tax cuts might not have been celebrated as visionary, but rather viewed as traditional conservative policy. Similarly, his leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis, while undoubtedly decisive, might have reinforced stereotypes of Republican hawkishness instead of being remembered as inherently bipartisan. Yet, Kennedy's personal charisma and charm might still have transcended party boundaries. His youth, energy, and eloquence arguably defined a new era of presidential leadership in America, qualities that may have cemented his status as an iconic figure, regardless of party affiliation. This invites us to consider whether great leaders shape their parties more than their parties shape them. Imagining John F. Kennedy as a Republican forces us to grapple with a profound truth. The impact of a leader is deeply intertwined with his or her party affiliations and the historical context in which they govern. For Kennedy, his Democratic identity was both a product of and a contributor to the political coalitions of the 1960s. As a Republican, he might have rewritten not only his own impact on history, but also the trajectories of the Democratic and Republican parties. This alternate history is not just a fun exercise in what-ifs. It's a lens through which we can better understand the fluidity of political ideologies and the ways in which individual leaders shape national trajectories. Could a Republican Kennedy have bridged partisan divides, creating a less polarized America? Or would his presidency have driven deeper wedges between progressive and conservative factions? Ultimately, we cannot know, but by asking the question, we open up meaningful dialogue about identity, leadership, and the unpredictable forces that mold political history. What do you think? How would a Republican JFK have reshaped America? Would he have risen to greater heights or faltered under the constraints of a different party platform? Share your thoughts, and let's keep the discussion going. After all, history is as much about the questions we ask as it is about the answers we uncover. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.